So he calls up Franklin Roosevelt. You guys understand that this time there's actually transatlantic telephone lines, so he could do this. And he basically told Franklin Roosevelt that we are in trouble, dude, and you better help us or you're next. And I got to tell you, at least somewhere in the back of the Nazi mind, there was, the objective of taking over the New World too. That would be part of this step. And and Roosevelt really wanted to help. He wanted to help the British. There's no doubt. He wanted to help Churchill. There's no doubt about that. But he had to overcome this feeling of the Americans that they didn't want to be involved in this situation. So he did his classic routine. He went on the radio in a fireside chat, and he used this kind of analogy. He said, if your neighbor's house is on fire, you don't charge them for the hose, to put it out. You give them the hose because you want them to put that fire out because you know it can spread to your house. So he basically said then that the British house is on fire and we need to stop the damage there. So we need to give the British everything they need to stop this, to stop this menace that is going to challenge us. So the end result of that, and I held up my cue card too soon, sorry about that. In 1940, the United States will pass something called the Lend-Lease Act. So this is the United States proclaiming that they had the right to lend, lease, or otherwise distribute. So understand that could also just mean give, We could give materials that are needed for the national security of some country whose national security will impact our national security. He did say that we aren't going to get involved in the war, but let us give the British the means to fight the war and defend themselves and keep the Nazi menace at bay. That was the primary idea. Now, to underwrite this, the United States will write a check, an appropriation for $7 billion. That was the largest single check ever written by the United States government up until that time. That was the beginning of what would become an incredible expenditure of something like $54 billion across the entire time of World War II. And I do like to let you guys know that this money, is the United States, with its extraordinary economy, underwriting the effort of the Allies. A lot of it did go to Britain, but much of it went to the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union does most of the fighting of World War II. That's the most vicious part. Eastern Front was like the closest we've ever come to real hell on earth. So the United States, of course, is giving the Red Army the financial underwriting. We didn't give them weapons. We didn't do that. We gave them oil. We gave gasoline and tires. We provided them with clothing and shoes. The Russian soldiers thought the American shoes were just amazing, And we gave them all these support components, so that they could, as Winston Churchill would later say, tear the guts out of the Nazi war machine. The Red Army does most of the fighting, most of the suffering, most of the dying that will ultimately lead to the defeat of the Nazis. So, this becomes, Lend-Lease was the first inkling of an incredible bias neutrality on the part of the United States to do everything they could to help the Allies to defeat what, the Nazis were seeing increasing as a major menace, not just to Great Britain, but to the world. Now, although, and by the way, by the time we get to the latter part of 1940, Roosevelt kind of does exactly what Wilson did. He ordered American destroyers and naval vessels to shoot to kill. If they see any U-boat activity on the high seas, of course, they were to do it. So there's an actual shooting war between the United States and Germany in the Atlantic by the time we get to the end of 1940, even though the United States, of course, is still remaining essentially neutral from the outside of the conflict. Well, as you guys know, that will all change, and if you want to find out how the United States got involved in the war, of course, you don't focus on activities in the Atlantic. Instead, you've got to go half a world away. It'd be nice if the map was a little bit more differently shaped, but half a world away to find out how exactly the United States got involved in World War II. And that will occur on December the 7th, 1941, a Sunday at about 9:55 a.m. The world is going to kind of explode for the people that lived on the island of Oahu. In an incredible surprise attack, we have to, at least to some degree, admire what the Japanese were able to do to take a very substantial fleet and go more than halfway across the Pacific Ocean undetected, kind of relying on absolute secrecy as they're proceeding to get within about 150 miles of the the Hawaiian Islands, and then to, of course, commence this extraordinary attack that will take place at a place called, I didn't tell you guys, of course, but the identification is Pearl Harbor on the island of Oahu. What will happen on December 7th, 1941 is the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor. Planning for this to the nth degree, they would use dive bombers, they would use torpedo bombers, they would have some high-level bombing, they would have fighters, of course, to come into it. They were going to attack a fleet at anchor. So among other things, the torpedo bombers had some issues that when you drop a torpedo bomb, from a plane, it would dive and then it would come back up to do its thing. But they couldn't allow it to dive too deep, or just going to the muck of the bottom of the bay. So they'd put these special wooden kind of things to make sure that it didn't dive too deep. But in these two concerted attacks, each one's lasting somewhere in less than 20 minutes over a period of, when you extend the entire period, it's about an hour and a half that will all happen, beginning just around 8 o'clock in the morning. These two waves, the Japanese Imperial Navy of Japan, of course, will attack the naval facilities at Pearl Harbor and other areas around the area, not just those two, but other areas, in this extraordinary and violent surprise attack. In the end, massive destruction for the American side. 9 battleships destroyed or damaged, though it is very amazing to me that the vast majority of these will be resurrected. The one that is left forever, of course, was the Arizona. It remains as the memorial, but some of the others are kind of patched up and ultimately put back to war. 5 cruisers will be destroyed, of course, in the attack. 3 destroyers will be attacked. One thing that didn't happen that is kind of critical, the history of the battleship is so interesting to me. It comes along, these dreadnought battleships, big ships at the end of the 19th century, to create these huge firing platforms that could shoot projectiles 20 miles, away from each other. And it was the thought that this would be the expression of naval power. But, they proved to be kind of untenable, and they're threatening, there's no doubt about that. But how do you have the battle? How does the battle even work in any kind of way? And even though they built these big battleships, there was no war where the battleship was like the dominant kind of component of the war. Instead, the big thing in World War II were aircraft carriers. And it just so happens that the 2 aircraft carriers in the Pacific Fleet were on maneuvers. They're not there. So what they're not destroying are the most important naval vessels of the war. So that wasn't part of it. Anyway, it wasn't just, of course, the ships that were destroyed, over 250 planes. They put the planes down there on the tarmac and just kind of put them wing to wing. And so it wasn't hard for the Japanese just to come down, of course, and strafe through their damaging plane after plane after plane. 250, of course, would be destroyed in that. And then, most importantly, just somewhat less than 2,500 soldiers and sailors, and ultimately some civilians, would be killed in just this extraordinary attack upon this American naval facility. Some of the saddest, there's so many things. This is Sunday morning. The men of the Arizona, mostly of them, did not have to get up that morning, of course. If they had been forced to wake up and, could more quickly move to battle stations, probably more of them would have survived the whole thing. There's also civilian dead, of course. There's a picture that it's a vehicle going down just a boulevard in Honolulu. And apparently what happened was anti-aircraft fire had arced up and then come down and hit the car, killing the occupants. But significant casualties, of course, caused by this attack upon Pearl Harbor. Now, of course, as you can imagine, it's going to take a while for the Americans to confront this, but the historical question is why? Why did the Japanese do this? And I want you to know that there are both kind of long-term issues in terms of the why the Japanese do this, and by the way, of course, I hope you know Pearl Harbor is an identification, and short-term issues that will lead ultimately to the Japanese activity at Pearl Harbor. But I want to give you both sense of this is the foundations of causation, if you will. So the long-term issue is the fact, it's 2 things really. You could call it R&R if you want. The long-term rivalry that had developed between the United States and Japan that developed in the aftermath of the American arrival in the Philippines. Throughout the early part of the 20th century, the Americans and the Japanese were kind of, trying to see who was going to be the big player in that particular area. It did develop into a serious military rivalry. It developed into an arms race as both, especially the navies, tried to outbuild each other. And I got to tell you, in the moment of Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy had the edge in no uncertain terms. So Japan was really trying to assert itself, and it saw the Americans as their chief rival for control in this particular area. The other long-term issue was racism. And racism was an even longer-term problem between the Americans and the Japanese. This is primarily racism towards Japanese Americans in the United States, and I got to tell you, primarily in California. The Japanese will follow the Chinese. The Chinese were first to kind of get hit as an anti-Asian feeling hit them. In the beginning, the people of California kind of welcomed the Japanese as an alternative to the Chinese, but fairly quickly turned against them also, in large part because the Japanese Americans were very successful in their economic activities, including agriculture, which they excelled in absolutely. So you see racism, anti-Japanese expressions in San Francisco, segregated schools, attack upon individual Japanese businessmen, and ultimately a move to exclude the Japanese. You see large political expressions of anti-Japanese attitudes. The racism that occurred in California became international incidents. You know, the Japanese were proud people, and they thought that the Americans were discriminating against their people. You know, they saw this as an anathema, and they would go to routinely. The ambassadors would make a case of, you know, why are Japanese Americans being discriminated against so much so in terms of California and the West Coast, and often, you know, this became an issue that the United States government had to somehow try to confront and deal with it. They could. So we do have. In terms of, you know, the long-term issues, the intensity, the growing intensity of the rivalry between the United States and Japan, who's going to be the big player in terms of the Western Pacific, and also the consistent racism displayed by the United States towards the Japanese Americans. Along with this came a series of short-term issues that were also really troubling and problematic in terms of the relationship. The primary issue was very straightforward and simple: the war in China. And the war in China, from the American point of view, was just a war of atrocity, primarily committed by the Japanese. And it's not untrue. You know, the Japanese war in China was one of the more brutal manifestations of warfare you're going to see. It was the first place I ever saw it. Not that I'm there, of course, but I saw newsreel footage of just, they would line up Chinese soldiers and just chop their heads off. They would behead these guys. And there's this extraordinary picture. There was the siege of Nanking, which was the capital at that time. And the Japanese had a hard time taking over the city, and when they did, they went into the city hall, and they basically took all of the employees out, and they massacred them there. You know, I think there's in excess of 200,000 people massacred in the aftermath of the siege of Nanking. And we have a picture that was taken that just shows, here's the steps of the city hall, and it's just littered with the bodies of those people that were brought out. You know, from the American point of view, this is like warfare beyond the pale. Warfare is that interesting phenomenon. I mean, if you're shooting at them and they're shooting at you and you kill them, no problem. But if they lay down their arms and raise up their hands and then you shoot them, that's a war crime. And the Americans perceived that the Japanese were committing war crimes, atrocities in China, and they were very unhappy with that. And they sought to damage the Japanese because of it, to punish them for their behaviors. There will be two significant punishments that will manifest during this period. The first was the United States will embargo scrap iron to Japan. Japan is an amazing country in so many ways, of course, so bereft of resources and yet so able to become a major economy in the world. You know, and whenever in the good old days when I would think of, like, if you bought a Datsun evolving to Nissan or Toyota, you really were simply buying a reincarnated Ford and Chevy. You know, the Fords would go to the wrecking yard, of course, and the scrap iron would be sent to Japan. They would redo it and send it back to us as a Toyota or a Nissan. So the Japan was very much dependent upon American scrap iron as at least one significant source. And the United States has said, well, we're going to embargo that. Embargo means we're not going to give you that anymore. We're not going to ship that to you. And it hurt Japan, but it wasn't necessarily the kind of critical thing that would impact them in a major way. But then in 1941, the United States said, you know, okay, we're going to push a little harder this time. And so they decided to embargo oil. And when the United States embargoed oil for Japan, that's a huge thing. The United States accounted for 80% of Japanese oil imports. And most of that, by the way, came from Southern California. In the 1920s and the 30s, LA is a major port for oil coming out of Southern California, with lots of it going to Japan. When the United States embargoed oil on Japan, Japan had basically, I don't know, 6 months or something like that of reserves, you know, and they're conducting a increasingly large war campaign in China and the surrounding area, and you know, modern armies run on gasoline. That's the way it goes. And so when the United States began to establish the embargo, Japan found itself in a situation, in a difficult situation. I do want you to know that at the very end of the war, as the United States begins to close in on Japan, one thing that happened was Japan just ran out of gas. I mean, their planes fell from the sky just because they ran out of gas. Their ships stopped dead in the water because they ran out of gas. So this actually becomes a huge issue for them. Now, what Japan needed, of course, was an alternative source for oil.